Welcome to another tax resolution training video from taxmarketinghq.com.
All right, now let's talk about combat zone accounts. In other words, how the IRS handles accounts that are for military personnel serving in combat zones. This is IRM 5.19.10.6. So we're taking a bit of a diversion away from our 5.1.7 because this is an important subsection in another part of the IRM worth talking about that's directly related. This IRM provides definitions and procedures for working combat zone accounts, including accounts covered under IRC 112 and 7508. So we talked about the types of areas. One of the things that you'll notice is there are certain personnel that they're not allowed to tell the world where they are going. And a lot of those might be special forces personnel that are engaged in contingency operations as declared by the Department of Defense. So we'll talk about obtaining proof and verifying this combat zone status here in a moment. But special forces troops in particular that operate in a contingency operation area can sometimes have an issue proving that they actually qualify for these exemptions. So currently, the IRS is not requiring proof of receipt of combat pay or hazardous duty pay for military personnel serving in direct support of the armed forces, but outside of a designated area. And this is an important subnote in particular. So it specifically states in the IRM, if you have a revenue officer or somebody else that is requiring proof of receipt of combat pay, refer them to this section of the IRM and tell them, no, the service is not requiring that proof right now. And it's in your own handbook. What I want to do is take a look at the actual geographic definitions going on right now. And these are updated in the IRM as necessary. So the first designated area that is still open is Afghanistan. And what you'll notice in this, and I will put a link to this directly in the chat box if you would like that, is that there are quite a few areas that are not directly in or adjacent to Afghanistan that qualify military personnel for the combat zone exclusion. So, for example, in the Mediterranean Sea, east of 30 degrees east longitude between March 19th, 2003 and July 31st, 2003. What this tells me is that there was a some sort of a Navy task force or carrier battle group that was operating in the Mediterranean Sea and providing long-range air support for the operation in Afghanistan. Here's another one. Philippines qualifies being in direct support January 9th, 2002 through the end of the fiscal year in 2015. Okay, again, providing long-range support. So there are areas that are not immediately adjacent to the combat zone that are that make a service member eligible for these exclusions. Kosovo, along the Adriatic, in Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, etc. These cases can still be out there. Under executive order, the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, a lot of this is related to Operation Desert Storm. Yes, going all the way back to 1991. Okay, and this is still a presidentially declared combat area. The Sinai Peninsula, and there are some other areas here. So this is where you refer, IRM 5.19.10. This is where you would refer when you are working with a military service person that is saying, well, I was in a combat zone, or I was in a congressionally declared qualified hazardous duty area, or I was in a Department of Defense, special operations zone. This is the section of the IRM you would refer to in order to verify that it was indeed actually a designated area. IRC 692 subparagraph A covers what happens when an individual is killed in one of these designated areas. If such death occurred while serving in a combat zone or as a result of wounds, disease, or injury incurred while serving in that combat zone or qualified hazardous duty area, the individual is not liable for any income tax for the taxable year in which the date of death falls, or with respect to any prior taxable year ending on or after the first day of the period in a combat zone. So this is one of those small things that Congress has declared as a benefit conferred upon those who have paid the ultimate price serving with the armed forces. For military personnel that are reported as MIA, missing in action, and are later determined to have died at an earlier date, the same forgiveness of income tax liabilities arises. And so some of you may occasionally have clients that are widows or parents or something of that nature of a service member that was killed in action or missing in action in one of these designated areas. And the IRS may be going after that person, even though they've passed away, for collection of taxes. IRC 692 is your code section for fighting these kind of somber cases. Back to IRM 5.1.7. This is the section of the IRM that tells the IRS to suspend all enforcement activity against the taxpayer when they are serving in a combat zone. Information documenting when service in the combat zone began, called the combat zone entry date, is sufficient to suspend collection activity. These should be one phone call case closures or short-term case closures, okay? Especially because a spouse that is still here back home and is being pursued on a joint assessment gets the same privileges for suspension of collection activity. So examples of collection activity which should be suspended: conducting investigations to pursue trust fund recovery penalty. Okay, so 4180 interviews, summoning bank records, things like that. Those processes should not be occurring against an individual serving in a combat zone. Conducting investigations to locate assets and sources of funds for potential levy. Conducting investigations to determine the value of assets for potential levy. So basically the big things that go on in a collection investigation need to be suspended for a service member in a combat zone. And excellent timing on your question, Fanta. She asked, will the CSED stop during the suspension? Well, here you go. Per IRC 7508E3, the 10-year collection statute is not extended due to the collections, the stoppage of collection, of enforced collections during any period of continuous qualified hospitalization as a result of injury received while serving in the combat zone, okay? Although IRC 7508 applies to individual taxpayers, the IRS recognizes the fact that there are related BMF accounts. So the service allows business taxpayer accounts to be postponed if the account meets certain criteria. The postponement against a BMF account includes the suspension of all collection activity, including trust fund recovery penalty assessment, during the period of time that we'll talk about here in a minute, plus 180 days. So how do we substantiate when a service member is overseas or is serving in a combat zone? Okay, how do we know when these various collection suspensions kick in? Well, it should be fairly straightforward. Basically, what the IRM says is that we can basically take it at their word if somebody says they were serving in a combat zone. That is the basic summation of all these rules. Okay. So if a taxpayer says, oh, I have a business as well, I'm serving in a combat zone, please stop collection on the business, guess what? They get these 7508 protections for the period of service plus 180 days after. So IRM says when it is common knowledge or apparent that the taxpayer is in a CZ, oral testimony is acceptable proof. When it is not common knowledge or apparent, again, special forces personnel in particular, written substantiation such as a copy of military or civilian orders or a statement issued by the Department of Defense attesting that the combat zone qualification is met is acceptable. A signed statement secured by the taxpayer or a contact, such as a spouse or attorney, may be accepted as substantiation when a copy of military orders is not accessible. In addition, the IRS may have previously identified the taxpayer as combat zone personnel by entering a C-freeze. It's not uncommon for military personnel to have a C-freeze, and then they do a second or third tour in the combat zone, and so they are therefore the freeze may have been lifted, after 12 or 18 months, but a simple phone call saying, hey, they're on their third tour, we need the C-freeze activated again. The IRS personnel on the phone should be able to verify the previous C-freeze, take it to your verbal word, they'll see it in the account history, and they'll just add it back on. Again, the combat zone freeze code, the TC 500, that you should look for on transcripts, it suspends the accrual of interest and penalties for all tax periods. Okay? Accrual of interest and penalties stops. The 3-year assessment statute expiration date, that clock comes to a grinding halt. The refund statute expiration date, the limit on the 3-year limit on a claim for credit or refund on a 1040, that is suspended. Okay. Fonta asked about the CSED. The collection statute expiration date, clock stops ticking. Why? Because the IRS cannot take collection action. Essentially, all collection activity stops. Liens, levies, seizures, additional assessments, trust fund recovery penalty investigations, asset valuations, wage garnishments, all this stuff should be stopped. And so I don't think I answered it exactly. So just to be clear, Fonta, while they're in the combat zone, the CSED stops. And I'll run back to here. What you'll also see is that if they are injured in the line of duty and they are hospitalized, then the 10-year CSED clock will actually start running again following a period of time. The period of after the 180 days of being out of the combat zone. So while they could still potentially be hospitalized, and the CSED clock can be running. Okay. But ordinarily, while they're in the combat zone, plus 180 days, the CSED is stopped. This is an internal policy procedure. You'll see these all throughout the IRM. Instructions on what they're supposed to do. So internally, they complete a Form 4844, request for terminal action, and include the combat zone entry date in order to set the C freeze. What you'll see on the transcript is just the TC 500 and the start and end of the C freeze. You won't see the codes that relate to the specific area of the world that is in question. When it is determined that the TC 500 is no longer appropriate, they will do another Form 4844. That's an internal form, not something we have available, not something we ever see. And that will be processed to update the C freeze and reverse it.
For more tips on growing your tax resolution practice, visit taxmarketinghq.com. Thanks for watching.